Good morning, Lakeshore. Great to have you here, whether you're here or whether you're online. Warm and special welcome. My wife and I have faced this past week with a bit of fear and trepidation. It was 2 weeks ago that Pastor Frank had to preach. He broke his finger just before he had to preach. Last week, Brian Pulowski had to preach. 3 days before that, he blew his back out. Yeah. And I thought, this may be a trend. So I spent the week in bed. Had my wife bring me, whatever I needed to eat, and I'm here, healthy. Nothing happened to me. We did get a $50,000 check in the mail. No, we didn't. Don't. Just wanted Brian and Frank to feel a little bad, that's all. Anyway, it's a little bit strange that I should draw the taking charge of your life message about relationships. I'm the one that on Valentine's Day came in celebrating, was actually the day after, I guess. Anyway, celebrating the greatest Valentine's Day in my life. Because after 44 years of failing to meet wifely expectations on Valentine's Day, my wife finally said, "Isn't it great that we don't have to worry about all that stuff anymore?" I thought, yes! It took me a while, but I finally lowered expectations to the point where even I could meet them. And I thought, I'm going to write a book. And then I thought, and I have to tell people how to do this relational thing because, well, that's the message I've drawn, right? I have to teach about relationships. So, if you wives want to click out right now because you know kind of what's coming, hey, that's great. Anyway, the truth about relationships is this, and you know this instinctively, that your relationships have an impact on everything you do, think, believe, how you spend your free time thinking, because your relationships, they impact what you do, and they impact your happiness. Just think of any drama you have in your life, anything that's not going well, or anything that just has you upset and thinking about it. See if when you think that, there's not a relationship involved in there somewhere. Something that someone at work said or did that just roasted you. Some button that got pushed by somebody that knows how to push those buttons in you and make you anxious. On the other side of the equation, look at it when things are going well. When you're just in one of those times when life is good and things are right, and you think, it's going well with whoever. Relationships impact your life in a huge way. I don't know why they had to do it, but some people at Harvard thought it would be a good idea to do a study on how relationships impact people. So they did a study that was supposed to be long-term, but in the realm of 2, 3, 4 years. They did this in 1944, something like that. And they decided, as the study was going along, that they would continue doing it. And all of the participants said, yeah, you can do this study. The study went for 80 years. 80 years. And what they concluded was that people's relationships were the biggest factor in determining not only their happiness, but their health. That's how big an impact relationships have on you. So this morning, we're going to take a look at those. And we're going to take a look at them from a biblical point of view. And the good thing is that whether you believe the Bible is actually a communication from God or not, what you have to believe, if you read it, even in a casual way, is that it is a book about relationships. It's a book about relationships. And those relationships are from Genesis all the way through Revelation. They contain all kinds of relationships. Lots of them are dysfunctional relationships. So you should feel at home, right? As you read that, because there's all kinds of people that think strange things about how to relate to each other, or they don't understand it, and you can tell because their families are just a mess. And yet over all of that is God who is teaching us not only how to relate to each other, but how to relate to Him. The Bible is the foremost authority on what it means to live in healthy relationships with each other. There is no book like it anywhere. There just isn't. So we're going to look at the Bible today. And one thing I want to promise you, even as we look at the Bible and we look at a section of it that I think will help you in your relationships, what I don't want to promise you is that your relationships here will be perfect, or in this life, everything will go well. The first reason is that in any relationship, you're going to be part of it. We were looking at a psalm yesterday in Synergy. And David, who had written Psalm, said, "Oh Lord, please forgive the sins, my hidden sins, the ones I don't know, the ones I can't even see. Forgive those." Friends, that's all of us. We have ways of acting, we have ways of thinking, we have ways of doing things that we have no idea that we do, or we have no idea that other people don't do them. And so what we do is we go blindly into these relationships, and sometimes you can see that you cause reactions among people. Stuff happens, and people may start treating you in similar ways, and you don't understand why. It's because you're part of the relationship. There's things that you don't see about yourself or understand about yourself that are causing relationships to go in a certain way. The other reason that even if you take to heart the biblical imperatives that we're going to deal with this morning, the other reason they won't heal all relationships is because in any relationship you have to have two people in it to make it work. You have to have two people that will determine they're going to relate to one another in a healthy, wholesome way. You have to have two people in that relationship where you can talk truth to each other without calling names, without putting down. And you have to have that so that one person can say to the other, "I see it now. Please forgive me." That will go on in relationships as long as you live on this earth. So when we talk about relationships here this morning, and we talk about them from a biblical point of view, and we talk about how they're going to help you in your relationships, don't hold the Bible at fault because you don't attain that relational heaven on this side of heaven. Because as long as you're here, you will be working things out. The things that we're going to do today are going to help you. And I hope what I'm doing is keeping in the spirit of what this series is saying by helping you to see that as a result of this morning, you're not going to go and fix your relationships. Because it is far more important this morning that you learn to love God than fix your relationships. This is going to be key, because to love Him and to know Him will bring healing to some degree to those relationships. And you will see that as we move along. So that's the truth about relationships. The social connections are important, and the most important factor for your health and your happiness. And the Bible is the world's foremost authority on successful relationships. And it's far more important that you learn to love God than it is that you learn to fix relationships. If you love God, He will begin to fix those relationships. So how is it that we stay relationally healthy? How do we do that? Well, it starts with your relationship with God, as I've already said. When you learn to love God passionately, it changes how you relate to God personally. Matthew 22:37 says this, Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God." We're going to stop there for a minute. Notice what it didn't say. It didn't say, serve the Lord your God. It didn't say, sacrifice to the Lord your God. It didn't even say, as important as it is, it didn't even say, obey the Lord your God. It didn't say any of those things. The important factor here is that it says, love the Lord your God. What did that look like? Because what happened here in this instance is Jesus, he's dealt with some Jewish leaders that absolutely hate him. And they're trying to ask him questions that will trap him into something that will turn the crowds against him. What I mean by that is just before Jesus said this, love the Lord your God, what they had asked him is, hey, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? The trap in that question was this: if Jesus says no, the Romans will kill him. It wasn't like dealing with the IRS. They were more brutal and unkind than the IRS. If you didn't pay taxes or you were trying to help people or encourage people not to pay taxes, they would kill you. That's how it rolled. If Jesus said, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, the Jewish people will hate him and turn on them because they hated the fact that the Romans were oppressing them. They wanted to live free in their own little Jewish country, and they didn't get to do that. But what Jesus did when he answered that question was, he said, give me a coin. They gave it to him. He said, whose impression is on it? They said, Caesar's. And he told them this: give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. That kind of wisdom engendered more hatred from the Jews. They didn't trap them. Jesus could see through it all. Those are the questions that were happening. One of the Jewish leaders listening to this repartee between the Jews and Jesus decided, I'm going to ask him one. And we can't tell if it's a trap question or if it's just a hard question, because it had been debated by the Jews. And the question was this: so you've answered these questions well, the Jewish person says to Jesus. Tell me this: what is the greatest commandment in the law? And there were a lot of them that would have been dear to any Jewish person. For instance, something about the sacrifices that were made at the temple, because that's how they worshiped God that time. Or something about one of the 10 commandments, then they would think of several of them. But Jesus told them this: the first commandment is to love the Lord your God. That's the first commandment. And what Jesus had in mind is what he had in mind when he gave that verse of Scripture to the Jewish nation centuries before. It's recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, for those of you who want to go there. And what he had done before that section in Deuteronomy, where that verse, love the Lord your God, and we're going to see the rest of it, where that was given, was he made a list of all the things that God had done for Israel. How he called one of them, Abraham, from Iran and promised him this land. And then how he had taken them to Egypt and how they had proliferated there, and how by his mighty hand he freed them from Egypt through the 10 plagues, how he led them through the Red Sea and through the desert, and then how he appeared on Mount Sinai in his power and his glory so that they were terrified of him, and how he guided them at night and during the day and across the land. And now they're right there. They're ready to go into Israel, or into the new land, the promised land. They're ready. And he tells them, love the Lord your God. Now, all that was behind that in the book of Deuteronomy gets brought in when you interpret this, how to love the Lord your God. And what's clear and is in Jesus' mind when he said, love the Lord your God to the people that were there, what was clear is that the reason you love the Lord your God is first because of how he's loved you. It's God who's loved you first. He has poured out his love on you. He tells Israel, therefore, your only appropriate response is to love the Lord your God. The same thing holds true today. You look at, well, how would I love Jesus? And why would I love him, first of all? Well, as you get to know him in the Bible, as you begin to read who he is, as you begin to hear what he's done, it is very clear that he loves you. That he formed you in your mother's womb, that he called you out, that he fed you, that he gave you this whole creation so that you could live and breathe and have your being. God did that because he loves you and cares for you. He's brought you to this very place so that you can hear about him. He has been good to you, and he loves you with a love that you cannot even imagine. And the only fitting response to a God who loves you that deeply is to love him passionately. That was the truth for Israel in those days when the command was first given. That was what Jesus had in mind when he told that Jewish leader, this is the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God. Love him passionately because he has loved you so tremendously. Then the commandment goes on. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And what Jesus was telling them there is not, okay, well, what does it mean to love him with my heart? And then what does it mean to love him with my soul? What does it mean to love him with my mind? It doesn't mean that. What he's trying to say here is that you take this in its totality. Heart, mind, and soul. It's all of your being. You love him passionately with all who you are, with your emotions, with your mind, with everything. You throw yourself at this God who has thrown himself in love at you. That's how you're to love God. For you and I here today, it would include loving God by receiving him. You heard in the baptism videos today, you heard two men who talked about the fact that as they got to know who God was and what he was like, there was a time when all of a sudden it made sense. I need this God. And it's more than just believing that God exists. It's more than believing that even he died and rose from the dead. What you notice in both of them, there was a receiving that went on. They asked God to come into their lives. And until that happens, there's not a way to respond to God in a way that he has prescribed. Receiving him matters. Receiving his forgiveness matters. Receiving his Holy Spirit into your life matters. Receiving his word in the Bible so that you can live by it matters. Receiving him so that you can begin to know the people of God matters. Receiving God matters, and you can't really love him until that has occurred. John 1:12-13 reads like this. Yet to all who did receive him, because there were some that didn't, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right, the authority to become children of God. There was an adoption that took place there. And when you receive, you become an adopted child of God. You're a part of the family. From there, that's the basis for how you relate to him and how you express love to him. And then also you love God by knowing him. I was a little hesitant to do what I had planned to do. So I remember when I was a kid, I found some of the letters that my mom and dad had written to each other, like when they were engaged. In fact, they were married. And then my dad went, World War II, he went over to Japan and did that whole thing. Anyway, I read some of those letters. I was probably 4th, 5th grade, and I read what they were writing to each other. I went, ew. It just didn't seem like, why would they say that to each other? I remember asking him once, it's the first wedding I went to, and it came to the point, you may kiss your bride. And I thought the same thing, ew, who would do that? Like in front of people too, It was a few years ago when we moved, actually about 20, 30 years ago. Jeannie had saved all the letters that I had written to her, all the letters she had written to me, because in our dating relationship, she lived in Los Angeles, I lived in Palmyra, New York, and so we wrote each other constantly. And I read 2 or 3 or 4. I went, ew. I kind of feel like that, right? Telling you a personal story. But I'm going to tell you anyway. It's a little self-revealing. I feel like you're going to go, ew. But I hope it helps you. It's all that I can tell you about loving God by knowing him, and it's this. So there was a time I had known God for a long time. I had received him. I was working in a ministry, proclaiming him, helping other people find him, all the things that I did. And I would pray diligently, God, I need this, I need these leaders, this money, this. And I would pray and pray and pray, and virtually none of my prayers were answered. It was very frustrating. And I remember praying one day, I'm pouring my heart out to God in prayer. And when I say pouring my heart out, I meant I'm asking him for all this stuff so that I can do the ministry I've got to do. And I don't know how you know this, friends. I don't, but I know this. I know. I've had about 6, 8 times in my life. So I'm almost 70. So it's less than once a decade this happens. But a question fired across my brain cells. And I knew in a moment, this is God. This is him. And the question came to me, so what would you rather have, Brian? A growing church or me? Seems like they're both good things, doesn't it? But when it was juxtaposed one to the other, all of a sudden I recognized myself. I'm a gifted idolater. Now, I don't have like a statue that I go out and worship in the backyard. I don't do that, right? But when I say I'm a gifted idolater, I mean all my life I had made things in my life more important in my life than God was. I had done that a number of times, and I went through painful times when God broke those things out of my life and left me with nothing but Him. And I had done it again, this time with something you would think would be pretty good, like the church. But as I sat there in those moments, and it was just seconds, it was painful. And I realized that the reason I wanted all those things was so that the church would be big and growing. And if it was, I would be very significant. Because people listen to pastors of big churches. They don't listen to pastors of small churches. They don't. And I wanted to be significant. And I was making God my servant. And just so you don't think idolatry is some like little thing that you can kind of slip by, in the Old Testament, God identified it, and He said, idolatry is as the sin of witchcraft. It's messing with demons. That's idolatry. And I thought, I don't want to go there. And I repented immediately. And I had something on my mind for a long time. And I just said, okay, God, this is how long I pray. We're extending that so that it's just you and me. You and me. I don't even know how I'm going to do that, because I've never prayed like that or that long. Just never have done it. And we're starting today. In fact, we're starting now. Well, I had just prayed everything I knew how to pray. I'd asked everything I knew how to ask for. And I had this chunk of time sitting in front of me, and I did not know what to do. And I remember thinking, and again, I look back now, oh, that was you too, God. When you read my word, Brian, and you see what I'm saying, and you understand, and you respond to me, and we talk that over, you're praying because you're hearing from me, and I'm hearing from you. And so I remember that day, just starting to pray as if He was right there with me, because He was, and I didn't really believe it. I mean, I would say I believed it, but I didn't believe it. And so I continued that practice because I didn't want to have that idolatry conversation with God ever again. And as I did that, friends, it didn't take God very long to help me see that now I had a real relationship with Him. It was He and me, and we were communicating somehow. I couldn't really get my whole head around it, but it was happening. And what began to happen was He became a delight to me, an absolute delight. And I'm going to say this, it's not true, so don't hold me to it. It's not biblically true. But what I learned in my situation was when the requests ended, the prayer began. Now that's not true, because you get to request in prayer. You do, okay? But for me, whose prayer was probably 100% of my prayer time, all of a sudden, I couldn't get enough of just God time and talking with Him and thinking through and conversing with Him about what He had written to me in the Scriptures. And as I began to see how magnificent and glorious and holy and good to me He had been, there was a love that developed in me for Him and for that time. And prayer stopped being a discipline because He became somebody I ran to, that I wanted to be with. And when that happened, friends, He was so easy to love. He just wanted that relationship with me. And I say this because, well, I just felt I should. At number two, I thought, there are a lot of people like me who are living the Christian life serving, sacrificing, doing. And that's not all bad. Don't get me wrong. But it was when God became personal and I knew him and he knew me. When that happened and there was a real relationship between me and God, him loving me as he always had and me realizing it and just beginning to respond even though my love was just minute compared to the immensity of his love. Everything changed for me, at least with God. Friends, love God. Love him with all your heart and with all your mind and with all your soul, with all your being. That's where good relationships start. And that did occur with me as well. As I began to realize how deeply loved I was able to drop some of those things that would spark difficulties in relationships. Oh, I still have them. Don't get me wrong. Just talk to my wife. I mean, I'm not out of that yet. I mean, there is that part of me that's still, I don't understand and causes difficulties. And yet, I know this. As I got to love God, I was able to love others. There's a command that God gave us. It's the second part of this command. So Daniel, you can skip that slide. I'm not going to use it. I'm already past it. But that command was this. You love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love others as yourself. By the way, for those of you who take notes, you can just cross out what I wrote there, because it really wasn't very good, right? Just put there, love others as yourself. That's the second part of this thing. And again, please notice, it was to love others, not serve them, not be a good neighbor, not anything else. It was to love them, a love similar to God's with which you love them. And your neighbor, it was defined when the writer of Luke, who was Luke, he told the same story that I'm telling from Matthew about Jesus' command, and what he added there, which gives us a little bit more idea of what it means to love your neighbor. When the man asked him, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus told him, okay, so he tells him this story, and there's a Samaritan who Jews hate. They hate all Samaritans, and Samaritans hate all Jews. And there's this Jew that goes down a trail. He gets robbed, beaten half to death. He's laying bleeding, naked, whatever on the ground. Other Jewish people walk by him, and the only person that stopped and treated his wounds and put him on a donkey and took him to an inn and paid for his stay there and brought him back to health. The only person that did that was a dreaded, hated, evil Samaritan. And Jesus asked the man, so who's your neighbor? Who was the neighbor in this story? And he understood, and we understand, that our neighbors are not just those that live next to us. Maybe somebody at work. It may be somebody you don't know that needs help. But we're to love neighbors as ourselves. There's a teaching out there, by the way, that says, oh, if we're to love ourselves, then we have to focus on loving ourselves so that we can love others. That's not the point of this. That's not what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is saying is, you already do pretty well at loving yourself. You think of yourself selfishly and first all the time. Now, take that, do it for somebody else. Love them. That's how it's to be. And all the law and the prophets hang on those two things. Everything hangs on that. What Jesus is saying here when he gives this command is that you cannot love God without loving others. If you don't love others, you're just kidding yourself if you say, I love God. But he's also saying the opposite, that if you don't love God, you don't love others. You can't love others unless you love God. And some of you say, oh, yes, I can. Yes, I certainly can. And there are degrees of love that you can express to others. But here's what I think it means. In his book, New Morning Mercies, Paul David Tripp puts it this way: love that calls wrong right and right wrong simply isn't love. Real love rebukes and forgives. Asking you to tolerate whatever I do or say because you say you love me is a fundamental misunderstanding of what love is and what love does. Much of what we think love is simply isn't love after all. Real, biblical, self-sacrificing, God-honoring love never compromises what God says is right and true. And in that sense, unless you love God, you can't love others. But if you do love God, you can, in that way, love them. What I know is this: if you're going to build healthy relationships, friends, it's going to be because you love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and you love others as yourself. Because if you do that, not only will your relationship with God improve, but imagine what will happen in your relationships if all of a sudden your first thought is for that other person in the relationship. What's best for them? How can I put them first? How can I truly love them, not just get along with them? What would happen in those relationships, friends? So that verse, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love others as yourself. Let that be your guiding verse and your guiding thought for this week as you begin to establish that as a pattern in your life. Would you pray with me? I want to give you just a moment to talk with you and God. So you two, you and God, you can just tell him what you need, what you think. Do that right now. And anything that you think you need to get straight with him so that you can love him with all your heart. Would you make that commitment to him? For some of you, that's going to mean you receive him for the very first time. You may have learned something about his love for you today, a love that would die on a cross for you, a love that would forgive all your sin, a love that would give you eternal life, a love that would bring you safely home to him. Maybe for you that decision is to say, yes, Lord, come into my life and into my heart. And by the way, if you make that decision, would you let us know somehow? We won't hound you or stalk you, but we will do anything we can to help you grow in that relationship so that you can love God with all your heart. Maybe there's a relationship that you need to pay a little attention to this morning or this week. I can only tell you that if you love them like you love yourself, that will go a long way towards bringing some healing to it. So, Father, help us, I pray. Help us to love you and to express that love from you to others. Help us to live like that, I pray, for every single one of us, so that we can take charge of our relationships, so that you can have something to do with our relationships. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.